Section 31 of the Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by klbonds, The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon FLINT, Part 2, Chapter 13, The 12. For a minute or two, Rolla was not observed. She simply stood and stared, being neither confident enough to go forward nor scared enough to retreat. Childlike, she scrutinized the group with great thoroughness. Their comparatively white faces and hands puzzled her most. Also, she could not understand the heavy black robes in which all were dressed. Falling to the floor and reaching far above their necks, such garments would have been intolerable to the free-limbed Sanusians. To the watchers on Earth, however, the robes made the group look marvelously like a company of monks. Not that there was anything particularly religious about the place or in their behavior. All 12 seemed to be silent only because they were voraciously hungry. A meal was spread on the table. Except for the garments, the 12 might have been so many harvest hands gathered for the evening meal in the cookhouse. From the white-bearded man who sat at the head of the table and then passed out large helpings of something from a big pot, to the fair-haired young fellow at the foot who could scarcely wait for his share, there was only one thing about them which might have been labeled pious. And that was their attitude, which could have been interpreted, "Give us this day our daily bread, and hurry up about it." Apparently, Rolla was convinced that these men were thoroughly human, and as such fairly safe to approach, for she allowed her curiosity to govern her caution, and proceeded to sidle through the doorway. Halfway through, she caught a whiff of the food, and her sidling changed to something faster. At that instant, she was seen. A tall, dark-haired chap on the far side of the table glanced up and gave a sharp, startled exclamation. Instantly, the whole dozen whirled around, and with one accord shot to their feet. Rolla stopped short. There was a second's silence. Then the white-bearded man, who seemed to be the leader of the group, said something peremptorily in a deep, compelling voice. Rolla did not understand. He repeated it, this time a little less commandingly, and Rolla, after swallowing desperately, inclined her head in the different way she had, and said, "Are ye friends or enemies?" 11 of the 12 looked puzzled. The dark-haired man, who had been the first to see her, however, gave a muttered exclamation. Then he cogitated for a moment, wet his lips, and said something that sounded like, "What did you say? Say it again." Rolla repeated. The dark-haired man listened intently. Immediately he fell to nodding with great vigor, and thought deeply again before making another try. "We are your friends. Whence came ye, and what seek ye?" Rolla had to listen closely to what he said. The language was substantially the same as hers, but the verbs were misplaced in the sentences, and accenting was different, and certain of the vowels were flattened. After a little, however, the man caught her way of talking, and was able to approximate it quite well, so that she understood him readily. "I seek," Rolla replied, "food and rest. I have traveled far and am weary." "Ye look it," commented the man. His name, Rolla found out later, was Somat. "Ye shall have both food and rest. However, whence came ye?" "From the other side of the world," answered Rolla calmly. Instantly she noted that the 12 became greatly excited when Somat translated her statement. She decided to add to the scene. "I have been away from my people for many days," and she held up one hand with the 5 fingers spread out, opening and closing them 4 times to indicate 20. "Ye came over the edge of the world?" marveled Somat. "It were a dangerous thing to do, stranger." "Aye," agreed Rolla, "but less dangerous than that from which I fled, however." Impatiently, "Give me the food ye promised. I can talk after my stomach be filled." "Of a surety," replied Somat apologetically. "I were too interested to remember thy hunger." He spoke a word or two, and one of his companions brought another stool, also dishes and table utensils. Whereupon the watchers on the earth got a first-class surprise. Here they had been looking upon 12 men, living in almost barbaric fashion amid the ruins of a great city, but the men had been eating from hand-painted china of the finest quality, using silverware that was simply elegant, nothing less. Luxury in the midst of desolation. Rolla, however, paid little attention to these details. She was scarcely curious as to the food, which consisted of some sort of vegetable and meat stew, together with butterless bread, a kind of small-grained corn on the cob, a yellowish root vegetable not unlike turnips, large quantities of berries. She was too hungry to be particular, and ate heartily from all that was offered, whether cooked or uncooked. The 12 almost forgot their own hunger in their interest in the stranger. It was now pretty dark in the big room. The white-bearded man said something to the young fellow at the foot of the table, whereupon the chap got up and stepped to the nearest wall, where he pressed something with the tip of his finger. Instantly the room was flooded with white light from 2 incandescent bulbs. Rolla leapt to her feet in amazement, bunking painfully in the unaccustomed glare. "What is this?" she demanded, all the more furiously to hide her fear. "Ye would not trick me with magic, ye who call yourselves friends!" Somat interpreted this to the others. Some laughed, others looked pityingly at her. Somat explained, "It is nothing, stranger. Be not afraid. We forgot that ye might know nothing of this magic." He considered deeply, apparently trying to put himself in her place. "Know ye not fire?" Of course she did not know what he meant. Then, with an inspiration, "Perchance ye have seen the flower, the red flower ye might call—" "Aye," eagerly. "Doth it grow here?" Somat smiled with satisfaction, and beckoned for her to follow him. He led the way through a small door into another room, evidently used as a kitchen. There he pointed to a large range, remarkably like the up-to-date article known on Earth. "The flower groweth here," said he, and lifted a lid from the stove. Up shot the flame. "Great Mownoth!" shouted Rolla, forgetting all about her hunger. "I have found it, the precious flower itself." Somat humored her childlike viewpoint. "We have the seed of the flower, too," said he. He secured a box of matches from a shelf, and showed her the little sticks. "Exactly what an angel showed me," jubilated Rolla. "I have come to the right place." Back she went to her food, her face radiant, and all her lurking suspicion of the 12 completely gone. From that time on she had absolute and unquestioning confidence in all that was told her. In her eyes, the 12 were simply angels or gods who had seen fit to clothe themselves queerly and act human. Supper over, she felt immensely tired. All the strain of the past 3 weeks had to have its reaction. Like a very tired, sleepy child, she was led into a room in another part of the building, where she was shown an ordinary sleeping cot. She promptly pulled the mattress onto the floor where she considered it belonged, and fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, back on the earth, Van Emmon and Smith had lost no time in making use of the doctor's description of the 12. Within a few minutes they had new agents. Van Emmon used Somat's eyes and ears, while Smith got in touch with the elderly bearded man at the head of the table. His name was Deltos. A very striking confirmation of the old legends, he was saying through a big yawn, as Smith made connection. He used a colloquial type of language, quite different from the lofty, dignified speech of the Sanusians. That is, of course, if the woman is telling the truth. And I think she is, declared the young fellow at the foot of the table. It makes me feel pretty small to think that none of us ever had the nerve to make the trip, while she, ignorant as she is, dared it all and succeeded. You forget, Sorplee, reminded Somat, that such people are far hardier than we. The feat is one that requires ape-like ability. The only thing that puzzled me is, why did she do it at all? It will have to remain a puzzle until she awakens, said Deltos, rising from the table. Lucky for us, Somat, that you saw fit to study the root tongues. Otherwise, we'd have to converse by signs. Neither Smith nor Van Emmen learned anything further that night. The 12 were all very tired, apparently, and went right to bed, a procedure which was straightway seconded by the 4 watchers on Earth, which brings us, in the most extraordinary manner, to the events of the next day. After breakfast, all but Somat left the place and disappeared in various directions, and Rolla noted that the robes were evidently worn only at mealtime. Most of the men were now dressed in rough working garments, similar to what one sees in modern factories. Whimsical sorts of gods, Rolla told herself, but gods just the same. Tell me, began Somat, as the woman sat on the floor before him. He could not get her to use a chair. Tell me, what caused thee to leave thy side of the world? Did ye arouse the wrath of thy fellow creatures? Nay, answered Rolla, and proceeded to explain, in the wrong order, as a child might, by relating first the crossing of the ridge, the flight from the bees, the master's cruel method of dealing with Chorus and Dulnop, and finally the matter of the fire itself, the real cause of the whole affair. Somat was intelligent enough to fill in such details as Rolla omitted. Ye did right, and acted like the brave girl ye are, he exclaimed, when Rolla had finished. However, he did not fully appreciate what she had meant by the winged masters, and not until she pointed out some bees and asked if, on this part of the planet, such were the rulers of the humans, that the man grasped the bitter irony of it all. What? Those tiny insects rule thy lives? It took him some time to comprehend the deadly nature of their stings, and the irresistible power of concerted effort. But in the end he commented, "'Tis not so strange, now that I think on it. Mayhap life is only a matter of chance anyway." Presently he felt that he understood the Sanusian situation. He fell silent, and Rolla, after waiting as long as her patience would allow, finally put the question temporarily uppermost in her mind. "It is true that I have crossed the edge of the world, and yet I understand it not at all. Can ye explain the nature of this strange world we live upon, Somat?" There was infinite respect in the way Rolla used his name. Had she known a word to indicate human infallibility, such as "Your Majesty," she would have used it. There is a saying among our people that the world be round. How can this be so? "Yet it is true," answered Somat. "Although ye must know that it be not round like a fruit or a pebble, no more is it flat like this," indicating the lid of the stove, near which they sat. "Instead, 'tis shaped like this," and he took from his finger a plain gold band, like an ordinary wedding ring. "The world is shaped like that." Rolla examined the ring with vast curiosity. She had never seen the like before, and was quite as much interested in the metal as in the thing it illustrated. Fortunately, the band was so worn that both edges were nearly sharp, thus corresponding with the knife-like ridge over which she had crawled. "Now," Somat went on, "ye and your people live on the inner face of the world," indicating the surface next his skin, "while I and my kind live on the outer face. Were it not for the difficulties of making the trip, we should have found you out ere this." Rolla sat for a long time with the ring in her hand, pondering the great fact she had just learned. And meanwhile, back on the Earth, 4 excited citizens were discussing this latest discovery. "An annular world!" exclaimed the doctor, his eyes sparkling delightedly. "It confirms the nebular hypothesis." "How so?" Smith wanted to know. "Because it proves that the process of condensation and concentration, which produces planets out of the original gases, can take place at uneven speeds. Instead of concentrating to the globular form, Sanus cooled too quickly. She concentrated while she was still a ring." Smith was struck with another phase of the matter. "Must have a queer sort of gravitation," he pointed out. "Seems to be the same inside the ring or outside. Surely, Doc, it can't be as powerful as it is here on the Earth." "No, not likely." "Then why hasn't it made a difference in the inhabitants? Seems to me the humans would have different structure." "Not necessarily. Look at it the other way around. Consider what enormous variety of animal forms we have here, all developed under the same conditions, the hummingbird and the python, for example. Gravitation needn't have anything to do with it." Billie was thinking mainly of the question of day and night. "The ring must be inclined at an angle with the sun's rays," she observed. "That being the case, Sanus has 2 periods each year when there is continuous darkness on the interface. Might last a week or 2. Do you suppose the people all hibernate during those seasons?" No one had an answer to that. Van Emmon said he would give all he was worth to explore the Sanusian mountains long enough to learn their geology. He said that the rocks ought to produce some new mineral forms, due to the particular condition of strain they would be subjected to. "I'm not sure," he said thoughtfully, "but I shouldn't be surprised if there's an enormous amount of carbon there. Maybe diamonds are as plentiful as coal is here." At the word diamonds, Smith glanced covertly at Billie's left hand, but she had hidden it in the folds of her skirt. Next moment the doctor warned them to be quiet. Somat and Rolla were talking again. He was telling her about his world. She learned that his people, who had never concerned themselves with her side of the planet, had progressed enormously beyond the Sanusians. Rolla did not understand all that he told her, but the people on the Earth gathered, in one way or another, that civilization had proceeded about as far as that of the year 1915 in Europe. All this, while fellow humans, only a few thousand miles away, not only failed to make any progress at all, but lived on century after century, the absolute slave of a race of bees. But it was a fact. The ancient city in which Rolla found herself had been, only a generation before, a flourishing metropolis, the capital of a powerful nation. There had been 2 such nations on that side of the planet, and the most violent rivalry had existed between them. However, Somat told Rolla, 'twas not this rivalry which wrought their downfall, except indirectly. The last great war between them was terrible, but not disastrous. Either could have survived that. But know you that the ruler of one of the nations, in order to carry on this war, which was a war of commerce, never mind what that means, in order to carry it on, was obliged to make great concessions to his people. In the other nation the ruler oppressed the workers instead, and drove them mad with his cruelty, so that not long after the end of the war there was a great rebellion among the people who had been so long oppressed, and their government was overthrown." Back on the Earth, the 4 investigators reflected on this in amazement. The case was wonderfully like that of Russia after the Great War. Perhaps. Immediately, the other nation forced its soldiers to fight the victorious rebels. But at home the workers had tasted of power. Many refused to work at all. And one day, behold, there were 2 rebellions instead of 1. And within a very short time, the whole world was governed by the working class. And this was what the Venusians had meant when they wrote that Sanus was ruled by the workers. What became of these rebellions? Rolla asked, little understanding what it meant, but curious anyhow. Devastation, stated Somat solemnly. He waved a hand to include all that lay within the ruined city. Not altogether because of the workers, although they were scarcely fit for ruling, but because the former rulers and others of that kind who liked to oppose their wills upon others saw fit to start a fresh rebellion. Conflict followed conflict. Sometimes workers were in power and sometimes aristocrats, but the fighting ended not until... He drew a deep breath. There were none left to fight. Ye mean, demanded Rolla incredulously, that your people killed themselves off in this fashion? Aye, sorrowfully. There were a few of us, they called us the middle class, who urged equality. We wanted a government in which all classes were represented fairly, what we called a democracy. Once the experiment was started, but it failed. Saw ye the skeletons in the street? He went on. 'Twas a dreadful sight those last few days. I were but a lad, yet I remember it all too well. He paused, then broke out fiercely. I tell ye that I saw brother slay brother, father slay son, son slay mother, in those last days. Lucky am I that I fled, I and my parents. They took me to a mountainous country, but even there the madness spread. And one day a soldier of the army killed my father and my mother. He sought me also, that he might slay me, but I hid from him beneath a heap of manure. He gritted savagely. I owe my life to a pile of manure. These other 11 men all have like tales to tell. Only one woman survived those awful days. Young Sorplee is her son. His father was a soldier, whom she herself slew with her own hands. Even she is now dead. Well, he finished after a long pause, when the madness had spent itself, we who remained came from our hiding places to find our world laid waste. 'Tis now 30 years since Sorplee mother died, since we first looked upon these ruins, and we have made barely a beginning. We have little heart for the work. Of what use is it, with no women to start the race afresh? Rolla started despite herself. Was this the reason why she, despite her savagery, had been made so welcome? Ye have not told me, she said hurriedly, why ye and the others all wear such curious garments when ye eat. Somat was taken off his guard. He had been chuckling to himself at the woman's childlike mind. Now he had to look apologetic and not a little sheepish as he made reply. The robes are a mere custom. It was started a great many years ago by the founders of he tried to think of a simpler expression than college fraternity. A clan, he decided. All we men were members of that clan. And, pursued Rolla, will ye give me the magic stone, that I may take the flowering blossoms back to my people, and release my loved ones from the master's cruelty? The great question was put. Rolla waited in tremulous anxiety for the answer. Aye, stranger, replied Somat vigorously. More. Ye shall have some of the little sticks. Whereupon Rolla leapt to her feet and danced in sheer delight. Somat looked on and marveled. Then abruptly he got up and marched away. He had not seen a woman in 30 years, and he was a man of principle. That night, when the 12 were again seated at the table, Somat related his conversation with Rolla. Since he used his own language, of course, she did not understand what was said, and I told her," he concluded, "how we came to be here, also the reason for the condition of things, and I doubt if she understood half what I said. We have quite a problem before us," he added. "What shall we do about it?" "You mean this woman?" Deltos asked. Rolla was busy with her food. "It seems to me, brothers, that Providence has miraculously come to our aid. If we can handle her people rightly, the future of the race is assured." Somat thought it was simple enough. "All we need to do is to send this one back with a supply of matches, and implicit instructions as to how to best proceed against the bees. Once released, their friends can make their way over the edge and settle among us. Let the bees keep their country." The two who had seconded him before again showed agreement. Sorplee and Deltos, however, together with the other 7, were distinctly opposed to the method. "Somat," protested Deltos, as though surprised, "you forget that there's an enormous population over there. Let them come in of their own free will, why, they would overrun our country. What would become of us?" "We'd have to take our chances," replied Somat energetically, "like good sports. If we can't demonstrate our worth to them, enough to hold their respect, we deserve to be snowed under." "Not while I'm alive," snarled Sorplee. "If they come here, they've got to give up their wilderness ways, right off. We can't stand savagery. The safest thing for us, and the best for us, is to make an industrial army out of them and set them to work." His enthusiasm was boundless. "I must say," admitted Deltos with his usual dignity, "that you have the right idea, Sorplee. If I had stated it, however, I would have been more frank about it. The arrangement you propose simply means that we are to take possession of them." "What?" shouted Somat, horrified. "Why, of course. Make slaves of them. What else?" End of Part 2, Chapter 13. Recording by klbonds. Section 32 of the Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by klbonds. The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon FLINT. Part 2, Chapter 14, The Slave Raid. Despite all that Somat and his 2 backers could say, the other 9 men swiftly agreed upon the thing Deltos had proposed. Somat went so far as to declare that he would warn Rolla, but he was instantly given to understand that such a move would be disastrous to himself. In the end, he was made to agree not to tell her. "We aren't going to let you and your idealism spoil our only chance to save the race," Sorplee told him pugnaciously, and Somat gave his word. At first, he hoped that the 9 might fall out among themselves when it came to actually enslaving the Sanusians. But he soon concluded that if there was any difference of opinion, the aristocratic element would take charge of half the captives, while Sorplee's friends commandeered the rest. The outlook was pretty black for Rolla's friends, yet there was nothing whatever to do about it. Among the 4 people on Earth, however, the thing was being discussed even more hotly. Van Emmon found himself enthusiastically backing Somat, the liberal-minded one. "He's got the right idea," declared the geologist. "Let the Sanusians come out of their own free will. Let the law of competition show what it can do. Dandy experiment." Smith could not help but put in, "Perhaps it's Deltos and Sorplee who are right, Van. These Sanusians are mere aborigines. They wouldn't understand democratic methods." "No?" politely from the doctor. "Now, From what I've seen of Rolla, I'll say she's a perfect example of live and let live. Nothing either subservient or autocratic in her relations with other people. Genuinely democratic, Smith. Meanwhile, remarked Billy with exaggerated nonchalance, meanwhile, what about the bees? Are they going to be permitted to show their superiority or not? Van Emmon took this to be aimed at him. Of course not. We can't allow a race of human beings to be dominated forever by insects. I say, let's get together and put Rolla wise to what Deltos and Sorplee are framing up. We can do it if we concentrate upon the same thought at the right time. Smith did not commit himself. I don't care much either way, he decided. Go ahead if you want to, meaning Van Emmon and the doctor. I don't want to butt in. Don't need you, growled the geologist. 2 of us is enough. Is that so? Sarcastically from Billy. Well, it'll take more than 2 of you to get it over to Rolla. What do you mean? Hotly. I mean, with deliberation, that if you and the doctor try to interfere, I'll break up our circle here. They stared at her incredulously. I sure will. I'm not going to lend my mental influence for any such purpose. My dear, protested the doctor gently, you know how it is. The combined efforts of the 4 of us is required in order to keep in touch with Sanus. Surely you would not... Oh, yes, I would. Billy was earnestness itself. Mr. Van Emmon was so good as to blame me for what I did in that Capellette mix-up. Now, if you please, I'm going to see to it that this one, anyhow, works itself out without our interference. Well, I'll be darned. The geologist looked again to make sure it was really his wife who had been talking thus. I'm mighty glad to know that you're not intending to warn Supreme, anyhow. Maybe I shall, snapped Billy. If you do, stated the doctor quietly, then I'll break the circle myself. They looked at him with a renewal of their former respect as he concluded emphatically. If you won't help us stop this slave raid, Billy, then by George, you'll at least let the bees fight it out on their own. And so the matter stood. So far as the investigators were concerned, they were to be onlookers, nothing more. Meanwhile, the survivors of a once great civilization prepared to move in person against the bees. They did this after Deltos pointed out the advantages of such a step. If we rout the bees ourselves, said he, the natives will regard us as their saviors, and we shall have no trouble with them afterward. This was sound policy. Even Somat had to admit it. He had decided to be a member of the expedition, for the reason that Rolla flatly refused to accompany the other men unless he, her special god, went along. His 2 liberal-minded friends stayed behind to take care of their belongings in the ruined city. The expedition was a simple one. It consisted of a single large auto truck and trailer, the only items of automotive machinery that the 12 had been able to reconstruct from the ruins. However, these served the purpose. They carried large supplies of food, also means for protection against the bees, together with abundant material for routing them. A large quantity of crude explosives also was included. The trailer was large enough to seat everybody, and the 10 men of the party had a good deal of amusement watching Rolla as she tried to get accustomed to that land of travel. She was glad enough when the end of the road was reached and the truck began to push its way into the wilderness, giving her an excuse to walk. No need to describe the trip in detail. Within 3 days, the truck was as far as it could go up the rock wall of the edge. The point selected was about 20 miles west of where Cunora was hid, and directly opposite the upper end of her home valley. No attempt was made to go over the top, as Rolla had done. Instead, about 2 miles below the ridge, a crevice was located in the granite, and by means of some 2 tons of powder, a narrow opening was made through to the other side. Through it, the men carried their supplies on their backs, transferring everything to improvised sleds, 100 pounds to a man. While this was being done, Rolla hurried east and located Cunora. The girl was in a pitiful condition from lack of proper food and comparative confinement and constant strain. But during Rolla's absence, she had seen none of the bees. "What are you going to do now?" she asked Rolla, after the explorer had told her story. Rolla shrugged her shoulders indifferently. "These gods," she declared with sublime confidence, "can do no wrong. Whatever they propose must be for the best. I have done my part. Now it is all in the hands of the flowing blossom." Not until they reached the head of the valley, which had been her home, did Rolla ask Somat as to the plan. He answered, "Ye and the other woman shall stay here with me on this hill." He produced a telescope. "We will watch with this eye tube. The other 9 men will go ahead and do the work." "And will they separate?" "Nay. They intend to conquer this colony first. Then, after your people are freed and safely on the way to my country, the conquerors will proceed to the next valley, and so on until all are released." He kept his word not to warn Rolla of the proposed captivity. In that way, the fear of them will go ahead and make their way easy. Meanwhile, the 9 were getting ready for their unprecedented conquest. They put on heavy leather clothes, also leather caps, gloves, and boots. Around their faces were stiff wire nets, such as annoyed them all exceedingly, and would have maddened Cunora or Rolla. But it meant safety. As for weapons, they relied entirely upon fire. Each man carried a little wood alcohol in a flask, in case it was necessary to burn wet or green wood. Otherwise, their equipment was matches, with an emergency set of flint and steel as well. There could be no resisting them. "We'll wait here until we've seen that you succeeded," Somat told Deltos and Sorplee. "Then we'll follow." The 9 left the hills. The hours passed with Rolla and Cunora amusing themselves at the eye tube. They could see the very spot where their lovers were being punished, but some intervening bushes prevented seeing the men themselves. The other villagers were at work, quiet as usual, and it was plain that, although the bees were invisible, yet they were still the masters. Hardly had the 9 reached the first low-growing bush before they encountered some of the bees. None attempted to attack, but turned about and flew back to report. It was not long before Supreme, and therefore Billy, knew of the approaching raiders. "They are doubtless provided with the magic flower," Supreme told her lieutenants. "You will watch the blossom as it sways in the wind, and always keep on the windward side of it. This way you can attack the inferiors." The word was passed, bee fashion, until every soldier and worker in the colony knew her duty. The stingers were to keep back and watch their chance, while the workers harassed the attackers. Moreover, with the hives always uppermost in her mind, Supreme planned to keep the actual conflict always at a distance from the city. It was late in the day when the 9 reached the stream in whose bed rested the pyrites taken from Chorus and Dulnop. This stream, it will be remembered, flowed not far from the torture place. Deltos' plan was to rescue these 2 men before doing anything else. This because it would strengthen the villagers' regard for the conquerors. The bees seemed to sense this. They met the invaders about 3 miles above the village in an open spot, easily seen by the people with the telescope, and the encounter took place during twilight, just early enough to be visible from a distance, yet late enough to make the fire very impressive. "Remember, it's the smoke as much as the flame," Deltos shouted to the others. "Just keep your torches on the move, and make as much fuss as you can." Next moment the swarm was upon them. It was like a vast cloud of soot, only the buzzing of those millions of wings fairly drowned out every other sound. The 9 had to signal to one another. Shouting was useless. Within a single minute the ground was covered with bees, either dead or insensible from the smoke. Yet the others never faltered. At times the insects battered against the wire netting with such force and in such numbers that the men had to fight them away in order to get enough air. Supreme watched from above, and kept sending her lieutenants with fresh divisions to first one man and then another, as he became separated from the rest. Of course, nobody suffered but the bees. Never before had they swarmed a creature which did not succumb. But these inferiors with the queer things over their faces, and the cows' hides over their bodies and hands, seemed to care not at all. Supreme was puzzled. "Keep it up," she ordered. "Surely they cannot stand it much longer." "It shall be done." And the bees were driven in upon the men, again and again. Always the torches were kept waving, so that the insects could never tell just where to attack. Always the men kept moving steadily downstream, and as they marched they left in their wake a black path of dead and dying bees. Half of them had been soldier bees, carrying enough poison in their stings to destroy a nation. Yet 9 little matches were too much for them. Presently the invaders had approached to within a half-mile of the torture place. One of Supreme's lieutenants made a suggestion. "Had we not better destroy the men, rather than let them be rescued?" The commandant considered this fully. "No," she decided. "To kill them would merely enrage the other villagers, and perhaps anger them so much as to make them unmanageable." More than once a human had been driven so frantic as to utterly disregard orders. "We cannot slay them all." The bees attacked with unabated fury. Not once did the insects falter. Orders were orders, and always had been. What mattered it if death came to them, so long as the hive lived? For that is bee philosophy. And then, just when it seemed that the wisest thing would be to withdraw, Supreme got the greatest idea she ever had. For once she felt positively enthusiastic. Had she been a human, she would have yelled aloud for sheer joy. "Attention!" to her subordinates. "We attack no more. Instead, go into the huts and drive all the inferiors here. Compel them to bring their tools. Kill all that refuse." The lieutenants only dimly grasped the idea. "What shall we do when we get them here?" "Do? Drive them against the invaders, of course." It was a daring thought. None but a super bee could have conceived it. Off flew the lieutenants, with Supreme's inspired order humming after them. "Call out every bee and drive every last one of the inferiors to this spot." And thus it came about that a minute later the 9 looked around to see the bees making off at top speed. Sorplee raised a cheer. "Hurrah!" he shouted, and the rest took it up. Neither admitted that he was vastly relieved. It had been a little nerve-shaking to know that a single thickness of leather had been all that stood for an hour between him and certain death. The buzzing, too, was demoralizing. "Now to release the 2 men," reminded Deltos, and led the way to the torture place. They found Corrus and Dulnop exactly as the 2 women had left them 6 weeks before. except that their faces were drawn with the agony of what they had endured. Below the surface of the ground their bodies had shriveled and whitened with their daily imprisonment. Only their spirits remained unchanged. They, of all the natives, had known what it was to feel superior. For the last time they were dug out and helped to their feet. They could not stand by themselves, much less run, but it is not likely they would have fled. Somehow they knew that the strange head coverings had human faces behind them, and scarcely had they been freed before Sorplee, glancing about, gave an exclamation of delight as he saw a group of natives running toward them. "Just what we want!" he exclaimed. "They've seen the scrap and realize that we've won." Looking around, the 9 could see the other groups likewise hurrying their way. All told, there were a couple of hundred of the villagers, and all were armed with tools they knew how to use very well. "Who shall do the honors?" asked Sorplee. "Wish Somat was here to explain for us." "Don't need him," reminded Deltos. "All we got to do is show these 2 fellows we dug up." And it was not until the first of the villagers was within 20 yards that the 9 suspected anything. They heard the buzzing. Looking closer, they saw that it was an attack. "Stop!" cried Deltos in swift panic. "We are friends, not enemies." It was like talking to the wind. The villagers had their choice of 2 fears: either fight the strangers with the magic flower, or be stung to death. And no one can blame them for what they chose. The 9 had time enough to snatch knives or hatchets from their belts, or clubs from the ground. Then, with wild cries of fear, the natives closed in. They fought as only desperate people can fight, caught between 2 fires. And there were 200 to 9. In half a minute, the first of the invaders was down, his head crushed by a mattock in the hands of a bee-tormented native. In a single minute, all were gone but 2, and a moment later, Deltos alone, because he had chanced to secure a long club, was alive of all that crew. For a minute he kept them off by sheer strength. He swung the stick with such vigor that he fairly cleared a circle for himself. The natives paused, howling and shrieking before the final rush. An inspiration came to Deltos. He tore his cap from his head and his net from his face. "Look!" he screamed above the uproar. "I am a man like yourself. Do not kill!" Next second he froze in his tracks. The next he was writhing in the death agony, and the bees were Supreme once more. Supreme herself had stung Deltos. End of Part 2, Chapter 14. Recording by klbonds.
Section 33 of The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gonzales. The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon FLINT. Part 2. The Emancipatrix. Chapter 15. Overlooked. Of the 4 on the earth, Smith was the first to make any comment. He had considerable difficulty in throwing his straw to the others. Somehow he felt slightly dazed. "This is unbelievable," he said. I repeated it twice. "To think that those insects are still the masters." "I wish." Bill's voice shook somewhat. "I wish almost that I had let you warn Rolla. It might have helped." She broke up suddenly, intent upon something Supreme was hearing. "Just listen." "Quick!" A lieutenant was humming excitedly to the commandant. "Back to the hives! Give the order, Supreme!" It was done, and immediately the bees cleared the throng of natives and their victims, rushing at top speed for the precious city. As they went, Supreme demanded an explanation. "What is the meaning of this?" For the answer, the lieutenant pointed her antennae straight ahead. At first Supreme could see nothing in the growing darkness, Then she saw that some of the sky was blacker than the rest. Next, she caught a faint glow. Supreme, the deadly flowers come to the hives. It was true. In 10 minutes the city was near enough for the commander to see it all very clearly. The fire started at the windward side, and already had swept through half the hives. "Quick!" the order was snapped out. "Into the remaining houses, and save the young!" She herself led the horde. Straight into the face of the flames they flew, unquestioningly and hesitantly. What was self compared with the hive? Next moment, like a mammoth below, the smoke rolled down upon them all, and thus it came upon the villagers, making their cautious way toward the bee city, shouted for joy and danced as they had never danced before, when they saw what had happened. Not a bee was left alive. Every egg and larva was destroyed, every queen was burned, and every last soldier and worker had lost her life in the vain attempt at rescue. Suddenly one of the villagers, who had been helping to carry chorus and Dulnop to the spot, pointed out something on the other side of the fire. It was Rolla. "Hail!" she shouted, hysterical with happiness as she ran toward the people. Cunora was close upon her heels. "Hail to the flowing flower!" She held up a torch. Down fell the villagers to their knees. Holla straight forward and fat chorus, even as Cunora located her Dulnop. "Hail to the flowing flower!" shouted Rolla again. "And hail to the free people of this world, and who take cometh for us all. The masters are no more." The four of the Earl looked at each other inquiringly. There was a heavy silence. The doctor stood it as long as he could, and then said, "So far as I'm concerned, this ends our investigations." They started at him comprehendingly. He went on, "I don't see anything to be gained by this type of study. Here we've investigated the conditions on 2 planets pretty thoroughly, and yet we can't agree upon what we've learned. Van still thinks that the upper classes should rule, despite all the misery we saw at the Capellette, and Billy is still convinced that the working classes, and no others, should govern. This in the face of what we've just seen. Sanus is absolute proof that what must happen when one class tries to rule: conflict, bloodshed, misery, little else. Besides," remembering something and glancing at his watch, "besides, it's time for dinner." Billy and Smith got to their feet, and in silence quit the room. Billy and Van Emmon were still fumbling on their bracelets. The 2 young people rose from their chairs at the same time, and started across the room to put flip bracelets away. The wire which connected them trailed in between and caught the doctor's chair. It brought the 2 of them up short. Van Emmon stared at the wire. He gave it a little tug. The chair did not move. Billy gave an answering jerk with similar lack of results. Then they glanced swiftly at one another, and each stepped back enough to permit lifting the wire over the chair. "In other words, Billy, we both have to give in a little, in order to get past that chair." Then he paused slightly, his heart pounding furiously. "Yes, Van." She dropped the bracelets. "And as for me, Van, I didn't really want to see the bees win. I only pretended to. I wanted to make you think." "Billy, I'll say cooperate if you will." "Cooperate." He swept her into his arms, and held her close so that she could not see what had rushed to his eyes. "Speaking of cooperation," he remarked unsteadily, "reminds me, it takes 2 to make a kiss." They proceeded to experiment. End of section 33, and end of The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon FLINT. Recording by April Gonzales in Cavite, Philippines.
Section 33, Version 2 of The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.Gramour. The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon FLINT. Part 2. The Emancipatrix. Chapter 15. Of the 4 on the earth, Smith was the first to make any comment. He had considerable difficulty in throwing his thought to the others. Somehow he felt slightly dazed. "This is unbelievable," he said, and repeated it twice. "To think that those insects are still the masters." "I wish," Billy's voice shook somewhat. "I wish almost that I had let you warn Rolla. It might have helped." She broke off suddenly, intent upon something Supreme was hearing. "Just listen." "Quick!" A lieutenant was humming excitedly to the commandant. "Back to the hives! Give the order! Supreme!" It was done, and immediately the bees quit the throng of natives and their victims, rushing at top speed for their precious city. As they went, Supreme demanded an explanation. "What is the meaning of this?" For answer, the lieutenant pointed her antennae straight ahead. At first, Supreme could see nothing in the growing darkness. Then she saw that some of the sky was blacker than the rest. Next, she caught a faint glow.
"Supreme, the deadly flower has come to the hives."
It was true. In 10 minutes the city was near enough for the commandant to see it all very clearly. The fire had started on the windward side, and already had swept through half the hives. "Quick!" the order was snapped out. "Into the remaining houses, and save the young!" She herself led the horde. Straight into the face of the flames they flew, unquestioningly, unhesitantly. What was self compared with the hive? Next moment, like a mammoth billow, the smoke rolled down upon them all. And thus it came about that the villagers, making their cautious way toward the bee city, shouted for joy and danced as they had never danced before when they saw what had happened. Not a bee was left alive. Every egg and larva was destroyed, every queen was burned, and every last soldier and worker had lost her life in the vain attempt at rescue. Suddenly one of the villagers, who had been helping to carry Chorus and Dulnop to the spot, pointed out something on the other side of the fire. It was Rolla. "Hail!" she shouted, hysterical with happiness as she ran toward her people. Cunora was close upon her heels. "Hail to the flowing flower!" She held up a torch. Down fell the villagers to their knees. Holla strode forward and found Chorus, even as Cunora located her Dulnop. "Hail to the flowing flower!" shouted Rolla again, "and hail to the free people of this world! A new day cometh for us all. The masters are no more." The four on the earth looked at each other inquiringly. There was a heavy silence. The doctor stood it as long as he could, and then said, "So far as I'm concerned, this ends our investigations." They stared at him uncomprehendingly. He went on, "I don't see anything to be gained by this type of study. Here we have investigated the conditions on 2 planets pretty thoroughly, and yet we can't agree upon what we've learned. Van still thinks that the upper classes should rule, despite all the misery we saw on Capellette. And Billy is still convinced that the working classes and no others should govern. This in the face of what we've just seen. Sanus is absolute proof of what must happen when one class tries to rule. Conflict, bloodshed, misery, little else. Besides," remembering something and glancing at his watch, "besides, it's time for dinner." Billy and Smith got to their feet, and in silence quit the room. Billy and Van Emmon were still fumbling with their bracelets. The 2 young people rose from the chairs at the same time and started across the room to put flip bracelets away. The wire which connected them trailed in between and caught on the doctor's chair. It brought the 2 of them up short. Van Emmon stared at the wire. He gave it a little tug. The chair did not move. Billy gave an answering jerk, with similar lack of results. Then they glanced swiftly at one another, and each stepped back enough to permit lifting the wire over the chair. "In other words," Van Emmon stammered with an effort to keep his voice steady, "in other words, Billy, we both have to give in a little in order to get past that chair." Then he paused slightly, his heart pounding furiously. "Yes, Van." She dropped the bracelets. "And as for me, Van, I didn't really want to see the bees win. I only pretended to. I wanted to make you think."
"Billy, I'll say cooperate if you will."
"Cooperate." He swept her into his arms and held her so close that she could not see what had rushed to his eyes.
"Speaking of cooperation,"
he remarked unsteadily,
"reminds me, it takes two to make a kiss."
They proceeded to experiment. End of chapter 15 of part 2, and end of The Devolutionist and the Emancipatrix by Homer Eon Flint.